Hello everyone, today we talk about the First Bulgarian Empire. This is the first time I think we make a video about Bulgaria in the first place, and we will make a summary of the main political and military events. This power in southeastern Europe that for centuries objectively represented a very important point of reference, especially for the Slav. The Bulgars were essentially a dominantly Turkic people that naturally had lots of other groups within it. Also, Indo-Europeans, etc. We're in an important time of transition in the Eurasian steppes. A lot of movements we can't, precisely track, but those are fundamentally the essentials that establish in what is, in fact, today's the era to today's Bulgaria, the time traced within nominally the Byzantine Empire on the Black Sea, actually very close to Constantinople itself, from which the Bulgar, eventually Bulgarian, as fundamentally the Slavic majority of the population, was capable to absorb ethnically, culturally, the Turkic elite, and forming this state, right, was always a looming threat on Constantinople. Geographical distance is not everything here. They are two different worlds. Constantinople here leaves a moment of crisis, generally speaking. They're the hardest centuries of contraction, to which the Bulgarians, for the sake now of simplicity, let's directly say Bulgarians in the unless we are not referring to the Bulgars as we will do mainly at the beginning now, contributed, but that also that was carried out chiefly by other populations, mostly the Islamic invasions, from which the Constantinople was saved, actually by the same Bulgarian intervention at times. So it's Constantinople was developing, as you know, as the true only city of the empire. Thessaloniki a little bit, but fundamentally the decline, the contraction, the economical and demographic shrinking and territorial shrinking of the empire, etc., brought to this essentially coastal reality, not even with an enormous maritime potential, meaning that surely the empire had a strong navy at this point, but mostly served, land armies as strategically, logistically, as it was normal at the time. Never quite developed that commercial, mercantilistic dynamism in the later centuries that instead starts emerging in the West. So it's mostly this urbanized coastal reality that can differ an incredible lot from the continental rural one, even a few tens of kilometers inland. Bulgaria is a good example, and broader Slavization of the Balkans is, right? The Slavs arrived up to the Peloponnese, hinterland, and even taking the sea at some point. Some surely reached Africa, etc. So, as you understand, we're also talking about a phase, making a bit of an introduction, because we should talk also, about the history of Thrace and how, the Slavization. But this is a moment of this great amount of waves pouring from different directions, and in this case, specifically from the steppes, in a dynamic that had already been observed with the Huns, with the Avars who were still there, as will be for the Magyars, that will give some trouble to the same Bulgarians at some point, and therefore the settling and the cohesion, the construction of a greater, right, a power that Bulgaria embodied. It became also through its Christianization, the old Slavonic script, etc., became a model for other Slavic peoples during the phase of evangelization of Europe, and objectively represented also a very important power. It was a major power in Europe. Essentially, if you look at the 9th century, well, aside from the Emirate of Cordoba, but fundamentally it was essentially the Byzantine Empire, the Carolingian Empire, and the Bulgarian Empire that also took different names because the institutional forms varied. This was not actually a dramatically stable power. As we will see, it had an important rise, but also fault that when we're talking about 300 years of something more of history, so you have to understand the times and places, an early medieval reality in certain areas of Europe that had contracted, never seen a dramatic level of urbanization or population concentration of communications, etc. But still, these dominations are very important because they manage to encompass very large amounts of territories, coming in contact with lots of peoples, right? Reaching here the Aegean, or also at some point invading Serbia, having to deal with the Pannonian power, expanding in Transylvania. So there is also a lot of historiographical, the historiographies of many countries, especially in the Balkans, still resent in a sense of the national issues of they are relatively recent states, independently speaking, from in a couple of centuries fundamentally after Ottoman domination. They naturally have an important and then eventually socialism, and then all what follows in this sense. But the essentials are clear, and things that in the same countries are expanding on, and then we have to follow very, very carefully, very interesting, right? Because properly the sources are different, right? Balkan history, also the same Byzantine history, is not Latin Germanic history. It doesn't have the same background, doesn't have the same level of development, it doesn't have the same level of documentation. Part of the reason being this instability, broadly meant. As you know, the Danubian frontier was something very different at this time compared to, the 2nd century AD, right? That but at the same time, that reveals also the previous stratum of certain areas that were, essentially civilized for a while, then eventually reverted to the population decline, etc., because of the nomadic movements. That, however, managed in early medieval history, and this is very crucial, because being there less people and being there less resources, movements, certain migrations were more impacted, right? Not much, broadly speaking, from an ethnic point of view, unless we understand it in a broader sense, but properly in shifting balance, right, of power easily. And the Bulgarian Empire, first Bulgarian Empire, because eventually, that was the second that was revived after, in the 11th century, as we will see, the Byzantines managed to crush what had been the already weakened structure of this reality, but never quite controlling the area, because the Balkans are a terrible place to control from a political and strategical point of view. Southern Europe has always been a nightmare for any army in that sense, and the Bulgarians not only, of course, maintain their an important autonomy, their own tradition, their own ethnicity, but at the major collapse of the giant, right, in 1204, and having already resumed important activity since the 80s of the 12th century, they managed to become some major players in the area, at least until the Ottomans fundamentally took over. And there is so much to cover about, especially Balkan history. I was asked, talk more about that. Yeah, it's right? It's embarrassing that I made more than 1,100 videos, never talked about Bulgaria or Serbia or, other important powers that in this time were the major balance shifters, in a sense, in the region. Anyhow, also, we're not given too much background about the ethnogenesis of the Bulgars. As we were saying before, these were mainly Turkic populations, but we find in their descriptions also, some of the first waves, some, Indo-European languages, things like these. So that's not so important. And important is what these people actually were. The Bulgars had established this power that is historiographically known as Old Great Bulgaria, the Patria Onoguria, which is quite eloquent of these sub-ethnic Turkic groups that fundamentally had been eventually crushed around at least, properly subdued largely by the Khazars towards the the second half of the 7th century. So this was located roughly north of Crimea. It was in contact with the Byzantine Empire that, as you know, was in the area, in the coastal areas of the Black Sea, with different degrees of control, of course, but enough for having already brought some Christianization, the baptism of the Khan. This major figure is Kubrat, that would be traditionally the father of these 5 sons who, after the Khazar take over, and because the Bulgars here were pressed between essentially the Avars and the Khazars, west and east respectively, and part of the so these very children took different directions. Some remained where they were in this old Bulgaria. Others moved in what would become the Bulgars, an important entity in Eastern Europe that would resist for an atrociously long time, even after the Mongol invasions, etc., and that we will make a video on. Then the Asparuh, right, led, that is in this sense, his own Bulgars in what would become eventually, in Thrace, and eventually setting the basis for Bulgaria. Others moved they settled within the same Byzantine Empire towards Thessalonica, because they had first moved to the Pannonian Plain, and then eventually the others had, there had been attritions with them, at first accepting suzerainty, then eventually, moving. Some were actually settled by the Longobards in central Italy. So there is an interesting picture here, properly, of the diaspora of this population. That, however, in the northeast Balkans, fundamentally founded this the most important power, arguably. History, which we're going to briefly resume. So, the Bulgars under Asparuh, so these were, as you understand, a nomadic group of conquestion people, a warlike one. The steppes had this cohesion, this fundamentally impossibility of having anything different in terms of, political cohesion, if not through this, militarized society that has always to seize the next opportunity to survive, right? Actually with a great fluidity. And as you understand here, the way justice groups had split, etc., is revealing it. So they moved into today's region, historical region, Eastern Europe of Bessarabia, just fundamentally at the outskirts, northern eastern outskirts of the Carpathians, and they entered through this Danubian channel, fundamentally, between the Carpathians and the Black Sea, this major highway where all the peoples that eventually migrated in Europe from the Eurasian steppes passed on into the essentially north of the Danube, specifically in modern Wallachia, right, and established themselves in the Danube Delta, that naturally had an important political and strategical significance for the traffics, for the also, the difficult ground could more or less shelter, like in other areas of Europe later on. Think about the Zaporozhian Cossacks, etc., all these things. It's important from eventual invasions, as it would occur, right? And naturally they knew that the major player there was the Byzantine Empire, that wasn't happy about these movements, but always ready, in fact, to counter them. They, in the 70s of the 7th century, they also crossed the Danube into what one knows as Scythia Minor. That was factually an imperial province, right? Provided with its steppe grasslands and pastures that were very important for the large herd stocks of this pastoral nomadic population, and the grazing grounds, right, to the west of the Dniester River, that was also already under their control. So naturally, it's a loose migration. I mean that when we talk about leadership in these groups, it's always a dominating element shift, and that manages to fuel the fantasies of loot and conquest of this warlike people. Doesn't have quite a firm cohesion on its own ground. And however, in 680, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IV, having recently defeated the Arabs that were threatening the empire, led an expedition at the head of a very large army against the Bulgars to try to oust them of the imperial territory. And they suffered a disaster. He suffered a disastrous defeat at the hands of Asparuh at Onglos, the Battle of Ongal also, in an unspecified location in and around the Danube Delta, right near the Pausa Island, right, today's Romania fundamentally. It was a swampy area, as you understand. Here the Bulgars had established an important fortified camp, because you know what was the deal there. They had no cities normally in the steppe. They built this massive entrenchments, like rings where there were fences, palisades, towers, ditches, etc. They would accumulate the loot to launch campaigns from there. They were controlled by the main leaders, and with other camps scattered in case of. And importantly enough, however, this population was already entrenching itself in the area. This weren't completely depopulated area, first of all, but also it was very important in this kind of labyrinth of marshes, of swamps, of rivers, etc., to establish, for example, certain embankments or fortifications that could importantly stop an enemy advance if manned with an army, right? This was always the deal. So if you look at, in other areas, I don't know, the Danevirke or Offas, Dike, etc. These were fortifications. If they are unmanned, they are completely useless, right? There is not a single fortification in history that has any strategic meaning whatsoever if it is devoid of protection. They all of them get surpassed. The problem is whether they are manned and protected. And actually, the Bulgars here had also the way they were settled properly. There were people inhabiting there. They would defend it on their own. And it was a broader, cohesion based on such existential needs of, preventing from being annihilated, right? So after Byzantine aggression, the Bulgars marched south. They crossed the Balkan Mountains and invaded Thrace, which, fundamentally it was the historical region proper, as the Danubian area is, at least there was an important division within Thrace at the same time, right? The southern Thrace is much more sedentary, agricultural. The Danubian area was historically essentially a semi-nomadic reality since antiquity. We know also from Thracian warfare was significantly different in this sense. And apparently this movement couldn't be stopped so much that in 681 the Byzantines were to sign a humiliating peace treaty in which they were also forced to acknowledge the Bulgars as an independent reality, and in this sense to provide concretely, the permission, giving permission to settle north of the Balkan Mountains, right? So not in the south, but still, this important area that was virtually like east, like the right bank of the Danube within Roman territory, and to pay them an annual tribute. That is a bit the normal way of dealing, diplomatically speaking, at any time in history, if you want to keep a population good, right, and under control. This is important properly for the internal dynamics of the people as well, because aside from the divide et impera, that you can't do when you have actually to march and conquer and deport these people, etc. But if they have if you can't really dislodge them there, it's better actually to provide them with greater unity so that you can properly co-opt these elites, hopefully, and not having lots of scattered clans that essentially do whatever the hell they like, because that's how they would mostly behave. Later on, in the 11th century, Sigebert of Jean-Bleu would say that the Bulgarian state in insight around the time had been already, an important reality historically, had been established, in fact, in 680, which gives a broader understanding of the fact that, yes, it was historically recorded that the Byzantine Empire had recognized this polity internationally. And the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, the time of Leo the Sixth, wrote of the aforementioned treaty, quote, "The Emperor Constantine IV signed peace with the Bulgars and agreed to pay them tribute for shame of the Romans and for our many sins, for it was wondrous for far away and close peoples to hear that he who had made everyone pay him tribute to the east and to the west, to the north and to the south, had been defeated by these unclean and newly emerged people." Right? Indeed, these were the next newcomers come from the steppe that was perturbing, the never really tranquility of the Danubian frontier. So from the Byzantine perspective, these were naturally where pagans were hardly, any, civilized by Byzantine standards, etc. So they were pointing out that in the face of much greater powers now that were harassing the Roman Empire, the Bulgars had managed to score this success by obliging the empire to tribute and to, being, as we will understand now, in broader political and strategical relations, kind of unescapable from complete subjugation, actually representing always a thorn in the side for the same empire, right? And another very important aspect that we were hinting at before that is naturally crucial for Bulgarian national identity and properly they're important from a historical point of view is the relation between the Turkic Bulgars and the local Slavs, right? That would, as we were saying before, eventually blend in together into the Bulgarian people, and the general idea is that the Bulgars effectively dominated the Slavs. That this is normal for this warlike semi-nomadic realities to arrive in a place and fundamentally ruling by simple right of rule. That is to say, who commands, who manages to impose a lordship, a domination, etc. considers, it's just considered the stronger has the divine right to rule, right? The reality naturally was more shaded because the Slavs, as were these 7 major realities around in the region, around the Danube area that had formed a sort of league would naturally negotiate such relations. But objectively, the Bulgars were superior from a political military point of view, right? They were, as we've seen, more compact, cohesive. The Slavs, we made videos about early Slavic warfare. They had migrated. They were much looser, politically speaking, right? Much less cohesive. They didn't come from from properly the meat grinder of the steppe. They lived in a sedentary fashion, and this sedentarized fashion, at least, they had migrated. Some of them were still on the move in a sense, but they didn't have the same political military development and hierarchies of these steppes raiders. This is the case, like it also had happened with the Avars that guided the expansion of other Slavic populations. It is also, however, an overstatement to say that the Slavs also didn't have contractual power, that they didn't have a hierarchy, or they wouldn't maintain an important autonomy in certain cases. They would, right? There were certain Slavic entities in the area where had managed to escape our control, that maintain an important, they were important realities. They would be a trouble for saying Byzantines, but we speak of this Reitervölker as a bit of shepherds of peoples and kind of guiding further and channeling further, being supported by this population. And the cooperation had immediately started, right? Doesn't matter, the Bulgars, we don't know how many they were. The sources, there is a debate. They were fundamentally between 10,000 and 30,000, that for the times and places in the area were actually a lot, right? Mostly, in fact, if we can think about properly cavalrymen and being peoples on the move and having, as we've seen, this broader natural military activity as their raison d'etre, and Bulgars were dramatic equestrian skills, like my military history mentor always reminded us, told us, never make the childish mistake of considering yourself more capable or more intelligent than a Bulgar horseman of the 7th century. And he was pretty damn right? But on the other hand, Clausewitzionally speaking, we know that you cannot really rule in a condition of minorities like they were compared to the Slavs in a land, especially in medieval times, without having the support of the majority of moral forces of the local population, right? So naturally, there were many Slavs who were seeing as the Bulgar arrival as, in part, as an opportunity to, fuel their own ambitions, expanding also the damage of the the detriment of the Byzantine Empire in a certain sense. There is a debate on this as well, because mostly people say that the hard stock of Bulgar traditional aristocracy would be mostly anti-Rome, would remain, and in this sense hampering the process of building kind of better relations with the country, and that this might have been largely supported by the Slavs, that were mostly farmers, etc., having a different lifestyle. Unfortunately, we don't know much about this. We know in general that, however, yes, the first conquest saw a domination of the Slavic population. There were surely tributes provided to the Khan, to properly military retinues, and this was surely the base of further military integration, as cavalry also needs infantry, and you can achieve certain importance, especially for defending a territory that was, in fact, largely populated by the Slavs that also had tried to essentially escape in the direct imperial rule in general, but also expanded in the sense far and wide in a kind of a looser fashion. So the Bulgars settled mainly in the northeast, right? They established their capital at Pliska, which was built initially as this entrenchment, like a bit in the Turkic style, of enormous surface, like for the time, 23 square kilometers, right? With earthen ramparts, palisades, and so on. So in all this, in the northeastern border, the troubles with the Khazars persisted, right? So much that the same Khan Asparuh died at the beginning of the 8th century in battle with them, right? Naturally, these populations would always try to subjugate each other. The Khazars, as we've seen, had the upper hand. The disintegrated old Bulgarian were trying to extend their control in this other of the survival branches, but there was an important, attrition. And this was an important setback. Asparuh was succeeded by the Khan Tervel, who ruled in the first 20 years or so of the 8th century. And he, in 705, he assisted and deposed the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, right, in regaining his throne in return for the Zagor region of northern Thrace, right? So you understand that the Bulgars were already importantly involved, naturally, with imperial policy that they sought to exploit in its instabilities, its plots and troubles, etc., to gain further, land in the area. There was already the realization, of course, that the people was there to stay, hopefully, for them, right? And therefore seeking, an increase in the definition of their territorial control, etc., was the next goal. For this, Tervel also acquired the title of Caesar as a prelude eventually to what would become, the imperial title later on, with it floating, depending on the political situation and the role here shared. From the Bulgarian perspective, seen as properly shared with the Roman Empire, right? Remember that in all of this, all these peoples are radically, violently, and almost pathologically obsessed with the idea of universal rule, right? The idea is that the worth of a people and of the single persons is based on how much they can rule. There is properly not, especially in the pagan perspective, there no other moral horizon of any other sort, right? It's all measured on the basis of how many men you command, how many serfs you work for you, and how far you can extend, and your fame and glory and reputation among the other people. That's it, right? And so the the Roman Empire represented, however, the top, like the manifestation of such divine power on earth as such, and naturally the Bulgars are, as competitors of the Byzantines, wanted to contain such primate. And Tervel was provided in this sense with also the obeisance of the citizenry of Constantinople, numerous gifts, as was properly he was enthroned alongside the emperor that he had replaced on the throne. Naturally, the Byzantines had a very different idea of what this was concretely like, right? This was mostly granting these barbarians, like, let's make them happy so that we can strengthen political ties with them. Of course, they can't share at all the Romanity of the empire, the universality of the empire. This is already the Byzantine mindset, but naturally, the Bulgars, and rightly so, like, I don't know, the Franks or other people thought differently, always, however, recognizing the might of the Roman Empire as an opportunity for themselves as well to exploit. And in fact, relations were unstable, and to say the least, Justinian, 3 years later this event, tried to reacquire the Zagor region by force, but his army was defeated in 708, in fact, at the Battle of Ankylaos, right, near the modern-day town of Pomorie in Bulgaria. Frontier warfare, hit-and-run strategies, and scorched earth, and all these, hideous, habitual practices of warfare continued until 716. Think in this properly in the sense of the structural weight properly on the populations, on agriculture, right? So on the basis of power, concretely, that a picture that here is internationally much more complex than we may, but think it even from the local perspective. Well, these were important things, and very often this kind of guerrillas, etc., can be even more ruinous than a major invasion if prolonged over time. Naturally, the ferocity and the violence and the utter contempt for anybody's, let's say, human rights in our modern perspective is, I don't think it's not even needed to be reminded. But again, that was normal for those time standards. In any case, Khan Tervel managed to sign an important agreement with Constantinople, which actually reinstated the previous borders, the imperial tribute, and also dealt with other, this kind of foreign relations, for example, regarding the exchange of prisoners, fugitives, etc. Here, I can't stress enough how frontier this reality is in so many ways, for which we don't even have to think there is like the Byzantines from one side and the Bulgars, eventually the Bulgarians from the other. Right, this is incredibly fluid, and there is all in endless historiography about these topics. Maybe at some point we can address, and the commixtion and the hybrid of civilization. As you know, warfare is not just the greatest potential destroyer of civilizations, but it's more powerful hybridizer, and this naturally, even in between enemies, you kind of get to know each other, you get to learn, you get to grow, right? And in fact, there is this major event which the Bulgars played a dramatically important role in European history, in Western perspective, etc. That is their participation at the defense of Constantinople in 717-18, was being besieged by the Islamic Caliphate, and could have consistently, the city might have consistently fallen after the Muslim success scored in Anatolia, etc., threatening the capital of the Romans. Well, Tervel sent his army to against the Islamic besiegers and scored a decisive battle before the Theodosian walls, when the Bulgarians, we can say, broadly meant, properly slaughtered the the Islamic army. We're talking about tens of thousands of dead, according to the sources. It was a major defeat, and in short, factually, the salvation of Constantinople. The Arabs were not at this point the Bedouins from the desert. They were an advanced civilization that had, in fact, dramatically benefited, if not overlapped concretely with the same Byzantine one, right? Starting from the fleets that were used to blockade Constantinople, that were all Christian, and coming from Egypt, Palestine, Syria, all the major shipyards of since ancient Phoenician, Hellenistic, Roman times, provided with dramatic naval culture, scientific, technological, siege capacities, right? So it was a real threat, right? The Theodosian Walls might have been really a bulwark against the main nomadic peoples, such as the same Bulgar, but against the Arabs here it was a real problem, because you can't see this like actually Byzantines versus Byzantines in a concrete sense, meaning that the land mass that from which resources were drawn to conquer Constantinople was factually the ex-Byzantine provinces, right? And this is quite crucial to understand. So the Bulgars contributed together with the Franks at Tours, and eventually the same Byzantines at Amorin, etc., to significantly halt the first Islamic wave, right? Eventually the Caliphate would disintegrate in smaller but still powerful realities, but this frontier area of Anatolia was recovered under essentially Byzantine control, and averted further threat toward the city, right? It was a major military event, and the Bulgars definitely contributed to it. Now, it would happen later on, even during the Second Bulgarian Empire, right? Constantinople might have fallen much more quickly to the Ottomans. The Bulgarians significantly contributed, even if it was actually for other contingental reasons that were quite utilitaristic, to such event. In fact, even the episode of the siege of Constantinople in 1718 has to be read in the sense that the Bulgarians at this point knew pretty damn well that if Constantinople had fallen, the Muslims would have swarmed in the Balkans, and it would have been the next ones, right, to be taken out. So it was a very pragmatic, cynic, lucid, rational, civilizational understanding of what was needed at that point. They understood that for the future of Bulgaria, securing here now at this point, in this moment of weakness, of peril, of danger, of emergency for the Byzantines, it was important to ensure their existence, at least, because they could be this important bulwark, and also given the major threat was another one, not Bulgaria, but still securing tribe, securing this civilizational output coming from Byzantine culture into this just sedentarized nomadic reality among the same Slavs that come from Central Eastern Europe relatively recently, and so on. So towards the mid-8th century, however, Bulgaria suffered an important crisis due to internal political strife, right? The ruling Dulo clan died out with Khan Sevar in 753, and the Khanate fell in a moment of deep crisis, which could have fragmented importantly, and as probably because in just 15 years, 7 Khans reigned, and all of them were murdered. That tells you that, what was the internal situation like. And this is normal, because as we were saying before, this nomadic peoples wouldn't culturally have originally kind of even a clear, defined understanding of territorial realities of, they would mostly seize the next opportunity possible. And sedentarization, civilization, political compaction passes through changes that are very difficult, culturally speaking, to enact from such a background. In fact, the causes of these struggles are not clear, right? But we know, of course, what happened mostly from Byzantine sources that are a bit self-centered, but probably they're right in stating that the main the main divide between the Bulgars at that point was properly the foreign policy to adopt towards the empire, right? And they were correct, right? They were at least we cannot separate the internal divide between within the Bulgarian elite, also the relation with the subject populations that probably also was directly connected with this, but still with the relation with the empire, right? Because probably, as we were saying before, the old Bulgar military aristocracy was less like it happened, I don't know, with the Germans mostly, and I don't know, the policy of Arianism or Catholicism. It's mainly the same thing. The relation with the subjected peoples, it's all one with the relations with the Roman Empire, Romanization, right? And naturally, Romanization is the future. Christianization is the future, right? But the old military elite that probably doesn't have many ideological problems with that, but it's rather worried by the fact that Romanization means the consolidation of certain specific clans at their expenses, is the main resistance factor in the process. However, the metus hostilis here came, as it happened with other peoples, right? There are many parallelisms in this sense with relation to the Byzantine Empire to save, in a sense, the state itself, meaning that Bulgarian stability was exploited by Constantine V, soldier emperor, reigning between the infamous Constantine Copronymus, however, aside from, literally the shit, because that's how, he passed to history, like mostly because of his detractors, but he was actually an impressive ruler for many reasons, including, in fact, his military skills. He ruled between 741 775, and he launched several major invasions of Bulgaria at the time. He had managed to contain the Islamic invasions during the first part of his reign. Now he concentrated on the Balkans after 755, and in fact he scored an important amount of victories on the Bulgarians at Marcella in 756, at Ankylos in 763, and Berzitia in 774. However, he lost at the Rishki Pass in 759, and in the process he also would lose hundreds of ships during a storm in the Black Sea. And this major offensive against the Bulgarians brought the local elite to say, wait a sec, we can't go on like this, right? We were attacked because we were politically divided. Always remember this in the history of mankind. What makes the difference from a military point of view has literally zero to do with anything like weapons, tactics, whatever. It has to do with one thing only, that is political cohesion, right? Will, moral forces, right? So this scare, this trauma, brought, because the Byzantines at that point displayed the world might of their military culture, brought the Bulgarians together again. In fact, there was probably an accusation against Count Sabin at a council that was brought together according to the tribal practices of the Serbs peoples, right, of the various armed nobility, the retinue, the freemen, right? It says, thanks to you, the Romans will enslave Bulgaria now, because of the policy, of enmity and so on. So there were some, however, it's already remarkable that Bulgaria stood on its feet at that point. In 774, Count Telerig tricked Constantine V in revealing his spies at the Bulgarian court in Pliska and held them all exterminated. As a consequence, the emperor launched the next year a retaliatory campaign against the Bulgarians, and even though he managed to defeat them on many occasions, the empire was not able to conquer the land, nor to impose its own suzerainty or a lasting peace, right? So this is being interpreted with, like, at that point, properly the realization of the Bulgarian realization and necessity of political cohesion, of properly this was probably a turning event, probably even in the shift in the political balance of what the future of Bulgaria had to be, its territorialization, its relations with the empire, its cohesion, etc. And it speaks also of properly, this is the story of the Balkans and the Byzantine relations with local peoples in a nutshell. That yes, you can't launch all these expeditions there, but these are, as we were saying before, terrifying places, full of forests, of rivers, of mountaineers, of you can't raid, you can destroy the farms, you can't destroy the fields, etc. But these people will entrench themselves in the swamps, in the forests, in the mountains, and you will not be able to dislodge them, and they will come back and they will resume guerrilla, right? And they will start. So this naturally means that they don't have also that enormous capacity of but here Bulgaria properly remained cohesive also properly from a political point of view. So it's all the more meaningful to properly realize what they managed to achieve in this sense. In fact, even this is also a matter, as I was saying before, of what the Slavic population was thinking at that point, because this point was like more than 1 century the Bulgars had arrived. You can easily talk about the Bulgarians broadly meant. It was a long process, right? There's nothing like a scientific, precise moment in which the Bulgars and the Bulgarians started. But the Slavic population, this, ethnic demographic prevalence, and its support, as we've seen, was necessary for the ruling elite. Began properly to understand that the opportunity to side with the Bulgars was crucial, because these wars had properly showed the face of the empire, the fact that, of course, they didn't give a freaking damn about these people, that dead or alive was just, maybe if they saved them, it was just to deport them for, naturally transforming them into peasants. This was done all the time, in a sense. It's always the same story. You invade these lands, you destroy their agriculture. You may scorch herd balls. You exterminate a bit of them. You rape a bit of others. You deport them. I don't know, in Asia Minor in part, and repeat over again, right, until they stop. And they never stop. That's the point, right? And this is a bit old medieval warfare in a nutshell, and especially in these more properly, still not quite mediated, regulated, advanced, statal realities, especially against these more like tribal ones. But that's where it gets bitter, right? It's kind of never over. It's a bit like Vietnam. You can kill 10 of them and lose one of yours, but they will keep going on. You will tire before it's over, right? And it is it's wild, it's rough, and war continued until 792, when Khan Kardam managed to defeat the Byzantines at the Battle of Marcella in 792. And it forced the empire, again, to pay a tribute to the Bulgarian Khans, right? And this battle marks the end of the major crisis occurring in the second half of the 8th century, where Bulgaria risked to be literally wiped out, and it instead managed to secure its cohesion, its identity, its role in the region. And this allowed Bulgaria to expand territorially, right? In a way, at that point, the Byzantines couldn't quite stop, because properly resources were exhausted at some level, but eventually this new people was still relatively new, was still well placed, had support, and there is here properly a moral victory in a sense, which was reflected on the political and strategical level. In fact, especially during the reign of Krum, her famous Khan, 803-814 reign, the Bulgarians doubled the size of their own territory, expanding to the south, west, and north, right? So mostly also here, in part, yes, also expanding in Byzantine territory, but also in areas that, as we'll see, they would not be dramatically opposing to. Don't think, as we were saying before, the Byzantine Empire is something homogeneous and compact, and fundamentally let's say, always all what Constantinople could hope for in terms of having enough deterrent power and projection capability of its armies to secure certain vital agricultural areas and coastal centers, and their main interest strategically was Asia Minor more than the Balkan hinterland. And in fact, the Bulgarians at this point were exploiting, famously enough, also effectively the fall of the Avar Khaganate that been decisively crippled by the Franks in 796. Charlemagne had led one of the single most important logistical operations along the Danube. In early medieval history, it was an impressive campaign that had completely destroyed and looted the Avar center. So, but that was on the southeastern most outskirts of the Carolingian Empire. So, effectively, the Avars were crushed by the Bulgars simply eat them alive, the few that was remaining there, and expanding in the Danubian basin. That was the one where the Avars have fundamentally ruled. And this allowed them to become properly a great power during the 9th to 10th century, as we were saying before, together with the Byzantine and Frankish Empire. So expanded in Transylvania, it was rich in mineral resources. Even there in the Carpathians, not managing to make much of a headway. But again, it's about the communities, right? It's about what deals you manage to achieve with them, what kind of deterrent threat you're able to put up, and it's all very intermittent. There is nothing like properly a permanent territorial occupation, if not on the major strongholds that were decided. For example, the Frankish border was established along the middle Danube or the Tisza, but also there, right, was far from the heartland of Carolingian power in northern France, fundamentally. And also the Byzantines tried to we were gradual, because this all fits the broader reawakening of European economy in this first phase, let's say in between the major invasions. The Byzantines also had were moving to consolidate their hold on the Slavs in places like Macedonia, northern Greece, right? So this had brought with new attritions with the Bulgarians that confronted the empire after some strikes that they had suffered. In 808, the Bulgarians raided the Struma River Valley, defeating an imperial army. In 800, they captured the important city of Serdica, modern Sofia. And in 811, the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus I launched a massive offensive against the Bulgarians that achieved important results, including the plundering and the destruction of their capital, Pliska. However, and this was the reverse and the turning point, and the army was decisively defeated at the Battle of the Verbritsa Pass. That was the Battle of Pliska, right? That was a massacre. The same emperor, Nicephorus I, died with most of his troops. It was a dramatic event, and also just to show you those ideas of leadership. The emperor's skull was lined with silver and used as a drinking cup by the Khan Krum, that could say at that point in the typical macabre tribal tradition that he had slain the emperor of the Romans. So what in the purely religious and military mindset of the world at that time meant that literally divine glory that had passed through by virtue through the emperor as an individual was properly drunk from the skull of the guy by the Khan Krum, that at that point could take on him the military glory of the skies and rule sovereign on the entire world. Naturally, reality was a bit different, but nevertheless, it was a dramatically, properly, blow to Byzantine image international. It was a major disaster in Byzantine military history. In fact, Krum also took the initiative and in 812 moved the war towards Thrace, captured the key Black Sea port of Mesembria, defeating the imperial army again at Versinikia in 813, and actually even proposed a generous peace settlement, as that would have been a right political move. Naturally, also the Bulgarians were strained after this prolonged military operations. It had a political cost also with the nobility, and they had to find an agreement still with the empire. However, in response, the Byzantines tried to assassinate Krum during the negotiations, and so the Bulgarians went on pillaging eastern Thrace, seizing the very important city of Adrianople. Now, as you know, it's very close. It's the gate of Constantinople, fundamentally, and governing the area of Thrace, an important agricultural area. In it, he deported the 10,000 inhabitants in what was said by the sources in the Bulgaria across the Danube, right? And this thing of deporting people is very important, because manpower, labor force is quite important to take properly somewhere else, not on the frontier where these were not military people. Normally on the frontier you do settle people. All these other groups that kept pouring every once in a while from the steppes, those are militarized. They're poor, that they just, if you give them some land, it's all they can ask for, right? And you can't settle on the frontier where they're gonna defend it in their own. But if you are deporting kind of civilized Byzantine population from a city like Edirne, you are bringing in the core land of your own empire, where they can bring to them their, not just their labor force, but also their expertise. I think Bulgaria here had entertained important relations, right? Had asked also, I don't know, some once they called for they asked the Longobards for shipbuilders. They had, surely as we've seen, interacted with the Franks as well. And after this, actually, Constantinople risked to be stormed by the Bulgarians, to be captured properly. History might have changed at that point, as the Khan Krum prepared a massive army, right? 5,000 iron-plated wagons were sent to build to carry the siege equipment. The Bulgarians asked for Louis the Pious to send Carolingian support, right, as the Carolingians and the Byzantines were confronted in Italy after the disappearance of the Longobards, and the attrition between two main powers was there. However, Krum died on April the 14th, 814. So the whole operation, this massive operations, was really grand style, might have achieved its objective, was aborted, and so things would go differently eventually. And Krum is a key figure, not just because of his victory in this important consolidation of Bulgarian power, but properly because in parallel with it, as it normally happens, and again the Clausewitz Trinity is not an opinion really, he had, in order to support this military expansion, began to regulate, right, the country, right, imposing equal rules for all peoples living within the country's boundary. This was meant also to co-opt this other elites, strengthening social ties, creating also kind of a engineering part of the rise of a consistent aristocracy in these new conquered lands. It was important for the army, for the coordination, for the broader unity of the empire. He was succeeded by Omurtag, ruling between 814 and 831, who concluded a 30-year peace treaty with the Roman Empire. This was important because, as after great phases of expansion, there is really a lot to recover. As we were saying before here, an entire battle, campaigns, preparations can really cripple significantly local resources for generations. It's no joke, really. and the previous century being tremendous, as we've seen in terms of warfare, etc. The border between the Bulgarians and the Romans was established along the Erkasia Trench between the deltas on the Black Sea and the valley of the Maritsa River at Kalugerovo. And at this point, the Bulgarian Empire stretched to the west up to Belgrade. It was known at the time as Alba Bulgarica. And in the north, west to the Frankish Empire on the Danube, fundamentally. That was secured by 827. In the northeast was more problematic because still the Khazars were around. The area along the Dnieper River that was mostly the frontier, the easternmost limits of Bulgaria. And in this period of peace with the empire, the Bulgarians also consolidated their government, their infrastructural capacities. For example, that's when in Pliska the magnificent palace was built, still with pagan temples because Christianity was still making its headway. There was the ruler's residence, the fortifications, the citadel, and the water main, the baths, right? These the people wanted to imitate the Romans in everything because that's where they drew most of their models of power for their rise of their own aristocracy, for establishing a more autocratic rule. It all stemmed from that model, right? Civilization, its benefits, moral, material ones. Here, buildings properly in stone and brick were built, right? In a world that was mostly about, timber, etc. And at this point, persecution against the Christians were still carried out, properly in an imperial fashion for political reasons, especially among the Byzantine prisoners of war settled north of the Danube that were in this sense an allogen population, as we've seen before, among the locals, and they had to be homogenized in a sense. At this point, the Bulgars are still properly perceived that they built pagan temples. They were as pagans by Byzantine sources and so on. And there was a further push south later on under Murtag's successors, and it is led by the Kavan, so the second in command of the empire, like a kind of a broader, minister, let's say, Isbul, also during the reign of the Khan Malamir. The important city of Philippopolis, Plovdiv, was incorporated in Bulgarian dominions. Khan Persian, in the first half of between the 30s and 50s of the 9th century, conquered most of Macedonia and the borders of the country to reach the Adriatic Sea near Valona, and also the Aegean Sea. There is not much about these events recorded, so scholars assume it was a largely peaceful invasion. The practice of how this would be carried out naturally was brutal, but yes, I mean these were mostly frontier areas. However, it was important also to control them for local agricultural resources. Of course, probably there wasn't much devastation. Also because the Byzantines seems not to have reacted, right? After all, these were continental areas, that wouldn't have this dramatic strategic relevance for the empire altogether, but still it was an important display of the fact that the Romans couldn't defend their own frontiers and penetration from further inland, and would advance, they would augment the proximity of the Bulgarian threat. And in this period between 839 and 842, the Bulgarians also entered in conflict with the Serbs that had fundamentally originated from within what was nominally the imperial, within the imperial boundaries, right? It was this reality to, like, the Croats. We don't know whether they were, exactly their origin was, but even in the local population was Slavic or Slavicized, and they had managed to emerge as a principality. It was also in the sense allied with with the Byzantines in an anti-Bulgarian fashion. In fact, the Bulgarians tried to invade the area, but that was yet another, tough nut to crack, and it was very difficult to make a headway in this mountaineer war-like communities. And Serbs didn't actually score any significant victory over the Bulgarians, but still the latter didn't manage to subdue them, right? If not, they would just claim tribute and obtaining even part of it. But and from the reign of Boris I between 852 and 889, things began to get worse as the Byzantines, the Eastern Franks, Great Moravia, this was the reality major state, this predominantly Western Slavic reality in Central Europe formed contingently. Also the Croats and the Serbs kind of coalesced against this growing Bulgarian threat, right? There was no real cohesion, right? There was a lot of back and forth. It was a confused situation. We can't even document in detail, but still was a moment of struggle after this important expansion to maintain these territories with its frontier peoples. And also some major natural disasters, such as allegedly 40 days of earthquakes in 863 and a lean harvest would produce a famine throughout Bulgaria, caused significant damage to, in fact, the empire's projection capabilities. Incursion of locusts are named, things like these. And however, the Bulgarians at this point had managed to achieve an important international, status that allowed diplomatically to deal with all these neighbors, to settle many of the situations, and to essentially maintain the Bulgarian conquests and frontiers intact, right? And this is also a phase of gradual Christianization, right? Christianity had always existed in Bulgaria. As we've seen, some Bulgars had been Christianized even when they were, in the steppes, right, on the Black Sea. And the reason, of course, is that aside from the antipodes with Constantinople, Christianization provides this, a dramatic civilizational tool for centralizing power further, giving it a more stable territorial dimension through ecclesiastical administration, creating, a discipline of obedience, of cooperation, of broader, goals, and it also was reflecting at that point in general the not just the future in that sense, but the Bulgarians understood that by Christianizing they would have entered this broader circuit now of the advanced peoples. So at that point were all Christian, and were in the countries were being Christianized, more powerful elites were emerging. So this would ensure also that the idea that they wouldn't be the terrible even Etons anymore in front of the empire. They could have had enjoyed significant relations with the papacy. Right at this point, as you know, Constantinople and Rome were containing a bit the Christianization of Europe, and the Balkans would fall mostly into, in fact, the Orthodox orbit, historically Eastern Europe as well. But it wasn't to be given for granted at the time either, as still this important rivalry between Bulgaria and Constantinople could, for example, make the first side mostly with Rome, which happened at some point. And Boris I converted to Christianity in 864. Naturally, the majority of the Bulgarians at this point would have maintained pagan beliefs, but still, as paganism is perfectly compatible with Christianity. It's just the other way around. Normally, it's not the case, but the thing was dramatically hybrid and unregulated. This is mostly, as always, a matter of elites, right? And there were bitter feuds, let's say, rivalries between Constantinople and Rome, as we were saying before. And Boris seized this opportunity brilliantly to establish the independence of a Bulgarian church, right? It was crucial. So this naturally meant a much greater political power in negotiations with the empire. The Bulgarians supported the evangelization missions. This is the time of Cyril and Methodius, which would create, in fact, properly a literary Old Bulgarian language that was functional, as we've seen, for the administration, for the creation properly of a state, of something more evolved and developed. And as a consequence, Christianization of Bulgaria was further enhanced with the ruthless opposition of any dissent, especially that was led, again, it's a matter of elite. It was the nobility. It was always a nobility that, for some reason, of rival clans compared to the ruling one, mostly there was a dynastic reality in Bulgaria as well, right? So the other nobility, they wouldn't give a damn about paganism or Christianity as long as they could rule themselves. But given that they were the ones that weren't ruling at the time, they would naturally side from the side of paganism because the Khan was being Christian at this point. Before it would have been, maybe it had already been different in a sense. And in fact, a Nobelia Revolt was crushed in 866. His very son, Vladimir, reigned also for a while, had rebelled, had attempted to restore traditional religion. This shows how how deeply divided, in a sense, still on this policy the elite was, but was again a chance in that case to rise to power before. There's plenty of these examples in any other context. In any case, in 893, the Khan convened the Council of Preslav, where it was decided that the Bulgarian capital was being moved from Pliska to Preslav. Right there, the Byzantine clergy would have been banished, as in the rest of the country, and properly a Bulgarian clergy would have come to the fore, right? And also Greek would have been substituted by Old Bulgarian in the Christian liturgy. And thus, Bulgaria secured an important goal, as we've seen, that would bring it to be the major competitor of the Byzantine Empire in the 10th century, threatening its stability, its security, and trying to almost superimpose to it, at least to share their power, and in a way that the Romans would take fundamentally a century before getting rid of. Now the Romans, in fact, couldn't have the moral justification of attacking a pagan country. And to avert a further Bulgarian penetration in Byzantine policy and society, they decided to move in 894 the Bulgarian market of Constantinople to Thessaloniki. This naturally was, a less prestigious center. Constantinople was, consistently the most important trade center, properly in the empire itself, and this naturally was cutting out Bulgaria from an important part of Byzantine international trade. So this had been part of, by the way, this connection been part of the freedom participating to the market. Constantinople, an important agreement, part of the agreement of the Treaty of 716, right? It was based on this national divide and interrelation. So the new Prince of Bulgaria was Simeon I, reigning between 892 and 927, was coming to known as Simeon the Great, right? Declared war on the Byzantine Empire, also defeated the imperial army in Thrace, and at this point Constantinople resorted to the Magyars that were essentially appearing in the European international scene as another steppe people at this point in the northeast of Bulgaria, so from the usual Danubian channel fundamentally. And the Magyars here, a bit like the Bulgars originally, had not, they were still looking themselves around, deciding where to go, where to settle, and they were essentially called by the Byzantines against the Bulgarians scoring two victories against them, and pillaging the Bruges in the area. However, the Bulgarians resorted to their also other steps connections by calling the Pechenegs. They were further east. It's always the same game there between neighbors. Who pressured consistently the Magyars from their side, and while in 895 the Bulgarian army managed to score a dramatic victory at the Battle of the Southern River in the steppes, and this prompted also the Pechenegs to advance westwards. Again, it would, as you know, they would also essentially expand in that direction later on. And this wave, paradoxically, brought the Magyars to push further west, actually passing through the same Bulgarian lands to settle eventually in the Pannonian Basin, where, as you know, they would give birth to modern Hungary, and becoming the next competitor of the Bulgarians. As you know, they filled that gap that had been left, in a sense, in spite of this ideal Frankish Bulgarian overlordship in the area, in the region, over the Pannonian Basin, right? Later, in fact, creating the Kingdom of Hungary, etc. Also, the Bulgarians, however, at the moment, managed to get temporarily rid of them. In 896, they also defeated the Romans at the Battle of Bulgarofigon. I made a video about that battle, and this the ensuing peace with the empire essentially confirmed the Bulgarian domination over the Balkans. It's important to properly realize the territorial dimension here. It's basically imagining all the lands of the right, let's say on the right bank of the lower Danube, up to essentially the coastal, up to the Aegean and the Adriatic, rest with a coastal strip, or sometimes not even, especially in the west, of a Byzantine-held territory, in the hands of the Bulgarians. And so this fundamentally brought to a further consolidation of Bulgaria. The commercial restrictions from the side of the Romans were annulled. Also, the empire was obliged to pay an annual tribute again to the Bulgarians, and this peace treaty remained in force until 912, albeit the same Simeon I sacked Thessaloniki in 904, right? Also obtaining further territorial concessions in Macedonia. This is a bit of time trouble for the empire. Thessaloniki was essentially the second city, the true only city other than Constantinople within the empire, and it was, as we've seen, also an important trade center after all. And here you see the Bulgarians are increasingly blackmailing the Byzantines with their political and military pressure. The Byzantine Emperor at this point reacted. It was Emperor Alexander in 913. Was fed up with the situation. He wouldn't. He thought that paying tribute to neighbors were substantially just, continuing to harass the empire, making expanding further it was illogical in a sense. So the Bulgarians had still the upper hand. In fact, Simeon I was searching for further confrontation, also hoping to obtain the title of Tsar, of Emperor, and to conquer Constantinople. So effectively creating a joint Bulgarian-Roman state. The Bulgarians never abandoned the idea that they were peers, at least, of the Romans, right? And this, of course, this is not what the Romans actually thought. So the Bulgarian further defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Acheloos, right? That was another striking success. And in the words of Theophanes Continuatus, quote, a bloodshed occurred that had not happened in centuries. Right? Leo Didion still said when he visited the battlefield half a century later that there were still piles of bones of imperial soldiers massacred, etc. And the Bulgarians kept pushing forward. They defeated Byzantines at Kata-Syrtai in 917, at Peja in 929, and at the outskirts of Constantinople in 922. So they were literally under the Theodosian walls, right? They reacquired control on Adrianople in Thrace, so just being next door. They expanded in Greece properly. They invaded the theme of Hellas. They conquered Thebes and went far down, deep in southern Greece. So this was a major offensive, and the Byzantines resorted at this point to some international help. Right, they couldn't fight much at the moment. It was rather forcing the Principality of Serbia to attack Bulgaria, because also they had this common threat in common. But the Serbians didn't have the manpower, the political capacity to make a headway. The Bulgarians contained them. They managed in 924 to ambush a small Bulgarian army, which caused a retaliation that ended up with literally the recognition of Bulgarian suzerainty over Serbia. That was still, however, out of the direct control of that. There was another power, however, that checked in the northwesternmost Bulgarian frontier. The Khan's expansion was Croatia, under its first king, Tomislav, who was also another Byzantine ally, and managed to repel successfully the Bulgarian invasion in 926. Right. At this point, Simeon I was seeking properly for striking a direct blow on Constantinople, but the main problem there being that as a essentially terrestrial power, the Bulgarians didn't have an effective navy. Yes, they had something in the Black Sea, but it was nothing like a structured fleet of naval power of a great maritime state. And therefore he asked for the help of the Fatimid Caliph in 922, Ubayd Allah al-Mahdi Billah in Mahdia, to properly contract this large Arab navy to use against Constantinople. The Byzantines, however, captured the Fatimid emissaries alongside the Calabrian coast, and this prevented further coordination between the Bulgarians and the Fatimids by Romanus I Lecapenus, and by also, however, countering the Bulgarian flattery by handsomely paying the same Fatimids and undermining therefore their need to cooperate with Bulgarians. And war went on between the Romans and Bulgarians until Simeon died in May 927. So at this point you have to imagine literally like the whole Balkan mainland basically occupied by the Bulgarians in a way, or controlled by the Bulgarians in a way or another. But the meaningful strategical impossibility of besieging Constantinople and therefore getting it over with the world struggle. And this tells you how far and wide the First Bulgarian Empire went in terms of power, right? Of political control. However, without properly the military capacity to conquer this massive infrastructural bulwark that the walls of Constantinople represented for millennia, in that until the Ottoman, actually, well, not for millennia, as in 1204 actually the Crusaders took it for, but that was mostly it was a lack also of internal control and other things, but essentially until the Ottomans a true siege properly man from both that would never succeed against Constantinople's walls. Even St. Palaiogo reconquered the city, but I think because it was devoid of garrison practically. Also, in this wall struggle, however, again, the Romans and the Bulgarians would exhaust each other. Right, there was the Simeon's successor Peter I, who reigned up to 969, negotiated a peace treaty. Right, again, the people, the agriculture doesn't make it anymore. Right, it costs too much, and at the expense of also other frontiers that we've seen are still somewhat hot or warm at least. They can't blow up at a certain point. Again, the Romans, however, were forced still in all this to recognize the Bulgarian Orthodox Church as an independent patriarchy, that so independent properly from the one of Constantinople, because that had always been the thing. If they were Orthodox, technically the metropolitic title was not recognized otherwise. And also to pay an annual tribute, but also to recognize the imperial title to Peter I. Right, it was also a marriage between Peter Romanus' granddaughter Irene, like appended. So it was a big international marriage. So this marrying into Roman royalty meant a lot in terms of properly also claims on the throne as a Roman ruler by a certain degree. And 40 years of peace followed, right, with some problems internally to Bulgaria. Two of Peter's brothers rebelled, and John in 928, Michael in 930. But these revolts were put down, and there was essentially a moment of prosperity, the golden age, if you want, of the Bulgarian state. Reflected also in the broader, the cultural production, for example, are beautiful. There's beautiful architecture in Bulgaria, to commit students with the same Byzantine culture in general, the economic expansion, political consolidation further. However, in this whole picture, in spite of great dominion that was created, the nature of a Balkan power in early or high medieval times is always, somewhat unstable, right? There is, as we've seen, not really a concrete, structured political or social, say, statal reality you can exploit properly. Meant the Bulgarians worked actually a lot for it, right? But it was about drawing resources from tributary populations, from making this effort to concentrate here and there in times where, as we've seen, resources were appallingly short, right, at hand. And with this broader nomadic movements around, basically unstable frontiers, because also what kind of frontiers are there? Fundamentally, it's the Danube, at the sort of valleys, etc., that you can control here and there with strongholds, but they do not hold to major movements if you don't send an army in, and that's always risky because it can shift. If you get annihilated, it can shift the internal balance. There is a limit properly in the resources, even as we've seen, the lack of technical or logistical capacity to besiege Constantinople is revelatory of the limits of what can imagine what Balkan power would compare to a caliphate, right? With a broader Mediterranean urbanized tradition, some important maritime capacities. Here, it's mostly a rural background, right? With many areas that are not dramatically fertile nor particularly easy to, because the main problem is how you can claim suzerainty on an area, but how much can you squeeze from it? That's a problem that remains up to the modern age in many countries. Like, what are the realistic chance to go knock at the door of a villager and saying, give me your part of your harvest because I'm the ruler, right? That takes manpower. That takes an administration. Takes a semi-permanent military. Takes something that it takes a lot in the history of civilization before, consolidating at a satisfactory level. Here we are, if you want, at the beginning of many of this, after a time of distress like the migration era had been, after epidemics, after invasions. It was a very slow, gradual process, right? And much of this cohesion, as we've seen, had to do with in fact, even generally with this lack of interest towards the Balkan hinterland per se. Like the Byzantines were, clever enough not to, bleed themselves out into an endless guerrilla for conquering what, some pasture and some, they would have naturally always their eyes pointed on the Near East, on Italy, on places that were dramatically more wealthier, right? Also, sometimes politically more divided, at least sometimes, and trying to survive in the first place from these threats altogether. And as we've seen, the capacities were quite limited. Very hardly these powers had a capacity to knock each other out, and all the time they would come close to it. Internationally, somebody would say, wait, freeze a second, because if that guy gets knocked out, we get a hyper powerful guy next door, and we don't want that, so we intervene. So there was also a matter of international relations, of isolation. As we've seen, it was very, very difficult even to get started, the path of Christianization, of etc. Another, in this sense, the decline and fall of the Bulgarian state occurred in part through foreign military intervention, not from the Byzantines, but from some of their allies, right? Namely the Kievan Rus in the northeast. That this area, this power had managed to consolidate. It was essentially an Eastern Slavic power that had been put together in a broader political dynastic form, and this various set of principalities that independent factually from each other, but all coordinated by the Varangians, the Viking adventurers, mercenaries, and so on. Well placed on the great Russian rivers, would trade with Constantinople, that was gradually Christianizing as well. It was just next door to Russia. They would be the ones who knock out the Khazars. There, as we've seen, had been a major threat for the Bulgarians at some point. And same, however, representing substituting them in the same role. Also, there were the Magyars that were, beginning to consolidate further, especially as they had been beaten by the Ottonians in Germany, so they would stop fundamentally most of their adventures in the west, as Latin Germanic Europe was consolidating now in an important fashion, also preventing such the headway of this more years, etc., and giving itself a more definite political and territorial concreteness, and turning naturally east at that point, right, with raids against Bulgaria in 934, 965. And so it was, the whole thing was coordinated with Constantinople, as you understand, and there was a greater insecurity expressed by the fragility that was exposed, the impossibility of stopping raids, of penetration into the territory. It wasn't much matter of properly of this external, of the risk properly of conquest, but properly of what the local communities would react like the landed nobility of Bulgaria, and also the new established church, etc., would start factually, taking sometimes matter on their own, right? The nobility was extending their personal privileges on the peasantry. This was helpful to coordinate a broader effort, but at the same time, it was becoming more important to negotiate with. It would acquire greater political institutional weight locally or centrally. There was, in a sense, also the spread of Bogomilism as a reaction to such elite consolidation, as the Balkans, as we've seen, were also generally less stratified socially, so an important amount of freemen would still have something to say about this. The Bogomilists were dualistic and heretics, fundamentally, that would eventually spread later on in places like, even the Byzantine Empire, northern Italy, southern France. Think about the Catars, right? And these were such a pain in the behind that they're basically the only group, like the only reason for which the Byzantines could conceive to launch something like a crusade that otherwise was completely alien to their mindset, their culture, because they were really a problem. They would lead a guerrilla that would present like this major unrest. They denied the incarnation of Christ. They would reject the cross because it was a material symbol. So this was completely irreconcilable with any kind of civilizational development possible at the time, and were some of the most radically violent repressions of these movements you can imagine as a consequence. The Byzantine Empire at this point was also faring discreetly well against the Arabs, as the Abbasid Caliphate was declining, essentially with the 11th century, towards the 11th century. The great Islamic civilization was effectively crumbling also there under the increased privatization, the spread of the Gulams, the Turks, with this further even feudalization, if you want, of the empire. The same Byzantine Empire had undergone something similar. As you know, that this is one of the major themes. If we talk about the paranoia, now we'll talk about Basil II. We made a couple of videos explaining about the dual thing, and naturally the connection with with Bulgaria as well at that point. So Constantinople thought well in 968 to call the Kievan Rus to invade Bulgaria. So much that the Kievan prince Sviatoslav I defeated the Bulgarians in battle. They captured Preslav and established another capital, properly as the Bulgarian city of Preslavets, meaning Little Preslav. And in this situation, it was what basically the Russians just marched in, right? And this was a problem at that point for the same Byzantines, because they didn't want the Russians to take the place of the Bulgarians and to double their power in the process, and to be the next threat. They had to make an important effort to Christianize and to bring in the orbit. So no. The aging Peter I at that point abdicated in favor of his son Boris II, who at that point was a kind of almost an hostage of Sviatoslav, given the situation. And John I Tzimiskes intervened at that point to reverse the balance of what had happened and defeated the Russians, compelled them to leave the Balkans in 971. And in the process, naturally, Bulgaria had been sensibly weakened by an invasion, and the Byzantines took the chance to seize Preslav and to capture Boris II, who was promised by John Tzimiskes that this was just, things would be reinstated, whatever, that, the Byzantines now had liberated Bulgaria from the Russians. But reality being that Boris was taken in Constantinople and forced publicly and ritually to abdicate his prerogatives. This was a radical blow to Bulgarian power in many ways, because not just the country was being invaded and showing in the sense all the weakness of this broader domination at that point in its history, but also with this event, the Bulgarians had fundamentally abdicated also their imperial prerogative, the independence of their church, and the Byzantines would consider them further any attempt to reinstate these prerogatives as a rebellion to the Romans. The Byzantines had also carried out an effective occupation of many areas. Actually, the only Bulgarian lands to remain free at this point were the ones in the west of the Iskar River, where fundamentally Bulgarian resistance gathered under the four Kometopuli brothers. That would be the last royal dynasty, in fact, of the first Bulgarian Empire. And by 976, the youngest of them, that is the most famous also historically, gathered most power after the death of his own elder siblings. And he became rightful heir to the throne. In the meanwhile, however, Boris II had escaped from Roman exile, so Samuel actually recognized it as emperor, right? He, while he himself would remain actually in control of the army, was a clever political move, because in a sense was a way to still herald the previous prerogatives of the imperial prerogatives of the Bulgarian state that had been denied by the same Boris, but he was forced into it. So it was a rally point, was a way of saying, the guy managed to escape the same Romans who obliged him to that, so technically, yes, we still stand as an empire with all its dignity, all its power, in spite of the their situation. And in this condition, in fact, there was no possible repristination of previous Bulgarian power, if not through warfare, and naturally, the Romans at this point had a much greater advantage. And the Byzantines, of course, wouldn't give a damn about any Bulgarian prerogative. They just wanted to crush them, definitely. But things went on for an excruciating amount of time, as excruciating long amount of time, as we've seen in the video about Basil II. The Bulgarian Wars were something. We made a video specifically, not just about him, the general one, but also about the cost of expansion. And the Bulgarian campaigns count as basically the ones that you can't say, was this a lost found enterprise? Because fundamentally they went on for generations without any definitive, like I said, yes, eventually the Bulgarians were defeated, but they still maintain a lot of autonomy. Even afterwards, they would never be completely taken out properly as a people, as a country, as a reality. In fact, would resume its power in late 12th, 13th century, but after submission. And these wars are possibly the single most violent among, at least the single most violent ones you can see in the entire period. There were some of the most ferocious struggles with massacres of unspeakable cruelty from both sides. It was something atrocious, like a true struggle for survival from two powers heading to this broader 11th century revival with new resources, but desperation fundamentally. Samuel was a good commander. He even managed to score an important victory at the Battle of the Gates of Trajan in 986. At this point, Basil II was almost killed, and that tells how dangerous still the Bulgarians were at this point. The Byzantine poet John Geometris wrote about this defeat, quote, "Even if the sun would have come down, I would have never thought that the Mazian, the Bulgarians, Arabs," you see all this ethnographic classicistic stereotype. Mazia was the area where more or less, on the right bank of the Danube in ancient times, stronger than the Ausonians. The Ausonians were the Italians, basically, in ancient times. So the Romans, the Byzantines, actually, and the means here. And when you fatten the sun, descend on the earth with your gold shining chariot, tell the greater soul of the Caesar, the Istros, that is Bulgaria, for the name of the Danube, took the crown of Rome. Take up arms, the arrows of the Mazians broke the spears of the Ausonians. And all this is the idea. But in part, yes, because meaning that the Bulgarians did maintain some, archery tradition, important equestrian capacity. Well, the Byzantines would do the same, but exposed to this nomadic peoples around the mounted warfare, even the Russians had developed dramatically in that barely realistic in this obviously highly stylized reality, but stereotypical in a sense rather than realistic. This was an important strategic moment as Samuel could push forward east and recover an important chunk of northeastern Bulgaria that included the old capitals of Pliska and Preslav. Right, so at this point there was a general coming back of Bulgarian power that launched offensives up to Thessaly, Epirus, the Peloponnese, right, recovering very important strongholds, and there was actually, even from the Byzantine side, a lot of defections because, as we were saying, the word mixed interests. Again, this is not a football team of ethno-nationalistic, dimension. These were conceived as universal multicultural powers, and there were lots of people who had mixed allegiances. Of course, who didn't give a shit wherever people came from, as human beings have always done for the sake of whatever power they want to get. And at this point there was a concrete risk for the Roman Empire to lose the whole Balkan hinterland once again, right? And the Serbian state of the Duklja was brought into the fight by Constantinople, but in 997 Samuel managed to defeat the Serbians and controlling their lands, right? He captured their prince Jovan Vladimir, and in 997 also the following the death of Roman, the last heir of Krum's dynasty, Samuel was proclaimed Emperor of Bulgaria. He temporarily established this alliance with Stephen I of Hungary. However, so there was a marriage between his son and heir Gabriel Radomir, Stephen's daughter. But Gabriel at some point rejected his wife, and thus in 1004 Hungary sent troops in the aid of the Byzantines against the Bulgarians, so that gradually the latter began to have the lower hand in this. And in fact, Basil II had resumed this massive military effort carried out with great method and consideration against properly Bulgarian towns, fortresses, not to launch this massive ventures into into the heartland of the enemy power, but fundamentally eroding its strongholds step by step. It was a very good strategy because it enabled to wear out the enemy, also securing this single strongholds and displaying at that point also the Byzantine superior logistical and besieging capacities. They weren't dramatically different from the Bulgarian ones, but came from an important different background, especially now after the collapse followed to the Russian invasion. The system had crumbled properly as a state. What had been created and had reprivatized again. So the world was feudalizing in nature. Basil II still was at the head of a mighty military machine that fundamentally had restructured the empire since the time of Justinian to an enormous force. So it was a very different reality, right? It was consistently Goliath versus David, and not always, David wins, in fact, but still Goliath can bleed, right? As the same battle of the Gates of Trajan actually showed. There was this annual campaigns launched by the Byzantines. It would go on for the whole year, right? So this is changing from seasonal to something more advanced, or probably an increase of professionalization, etc. This is the broader military reforms of Basil II. The Bulgarians resist atrociously, right? But they suffer this losses consistently that they can quite recover as much as Byzantines, but it takes a long time even for the Romans to shift this. In 1001, Pliska and Preslav fell in the hand of the Romans. In 1003, there was a major offensive along the Danube that brought to the fall of Vidin after an 8-month siege. That is a big deal for the time. Also, in 1004, the Bulgarians were properly Samuel was defeated at the Battle of Skopje by Basil II, who took possession of the city. The war went on for another 10 years, where finally the Battle of Kladin was fought, when the Bulgarian army was annihilated. 40,000 Bulgarians were captured, and there is the story that would go that Basil blinded 91 of them, leaving the 100th man just with one good eye, so that could lead this row of 100 people, leading back to Simeon, right? That allegedly died of pain for the side of his annihilated army, because they understood at that point that Bulgaria was lost, because literally there was nothing substantial to oppose in terms of a centralized army or resistance, and it would have left properly. It was a disaster, magnitude, enormous proportions. Basil II, that as a Roman emperor would have the title of, Porphyrogenitus among the others, that properly born in the purple, was nicknamed in a macabre way as Bulgaroknos, that is the Bulgar slayer, because of this massive bath of blood that had achieved not just in that battle, but properly the utter violence of the hunted down, butchering of any kind of resistance, of the kind of violence of Bulgarian opposition he would find. And so it wasn't over, because even at this point, as we were saying before, yes, you can't knock out the bulk of these people's powers, but fundamentally the aristocracies are going to be entrenched in the Balkan hinterland, and you can't really take them all out. And for example, Gabriel Radomir and even Vladislav continued resistance. However, there was a general halt because the country was exhausted, the people was tired, and during the siege of Dyrrhachium, the Bulgarian nobility surrendered to Basil II, and therefore their entire territory was annexed formally to the Byzantine Empire. And however, as we were just saying, the Bulgarians maintained their privileges, but many of their nobility was deported to Asia Minor, as properly as land base, and properly part of the manpower was properly for the Byzantine army was cultivated. They're also at least as good cavalrymen that could serve in the Byzantine army further, given their equestrian traditions and so on. And this was naturally a way to behead, but at least partly, the Bulgarian society of their elite, that, the Saint Basil had essentially, struggled in this direction within the same empire to reduce the abuse of the oligarchs, the great aristocrats, trying to maintain, enforce the fisc, the state, in an anti-feudal sense, but this is also maybe a bit too superficial as interpretation. In any case, this trend would be reversed in the following crisis of the 11th century now. And in the process, so Bulgaria capitulated. Its patriarchate was demoted to an archbishopric, right? And therefore it wouldn't enjoy independence anymore, but it had always an autonomy. And there would be other insurgencies and resistance, broadly speaking, to Byzantine power. It was concentrated mostly in the key areas, but again, the countryside was mostly left its own. There were other problems there, right? It's just that this massive bulk of the Bulgarian state had been wiped out as a consistent thing, right? It didn't exist anymore. In fact, the real resurgence of a Bulgarian power on a smaller scale, but still significant, historically in a different context, would restart under the brothers Azan and Peter in 1185, and with further expansion the following century. But that's all another story, another period. And it is important, however, to picture properly the broader, the dimension of this phenomenon. Like the Bulgaria had managed fundamentally to oppress dramatically the Byzantine Empire, consuming lots of its resources. Would have probably been reinvested in other conquests in the Near East and Italy, in places that would have conferred to the empire probably also a much more markedly novel dimension, maritime dimension. The things changed really a lot, and it's remarkable how much they lasted, how long this struggle went on. And we try to highlight the main reasons for this. We could go on with broader cultural, governmental, legal thing, but let's say we mostly make this the importance of the Bulgarian church for the development of all Slavonic literary production, the contribution properly in Christianization of the Slavs. It was a point of reference, right, for all that world, an important military development. We will make videos about the military organization of Bulgaria at this point. But I think here we sum up just the main political and military events to give a broader introduction to its history. Then we'll come back on it at some other point. So for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.